I more recently got into AI. There's some really interesting stuff with AI tech and healthcare. I won't go into detail with those, but what I will say, because I can see the conversations that are going on, like will AI ever replace human therapists? And people get very passionate about their answer to that. I personally think their answer is yes. My point for using that as an example is um, we need to constantly be innovating and adapting to the game. Stands itself up as something that's being old and traditional. It would never change. This is our strength. I think we're moving to a time where that the exact opposite needs to be the case. And we need to be okay with that, where the science is not always going to be exact, but we have to adapt. And AI is just one of many ways we can say that that's true. So the myth is the status quo is not always the best, and we're going to need to get to challenge it.
Hey everyone, this is Devin Miller here with another episode of The Inventive Expert. I'm your host, Devin Miller, the serial entrepreneur that's grown several startups into 7 and 8 figure businesses, as well as the founder and CEO of Miller IP Law, where he helps startups and small businesses with their patents and trademarks. You ever need help with yours, just go to strategymeeting.com, grab some time with us to chat, and we are always here to help. Now, today we've got another great guest on the podcast, Jacob Kendall. And Jacob, we're going to be talking about a few different areas, including how to treat patients and and make caregivers the central players for his industry and across the multiple industries. How you generally make people central players. How to focus on outcomes instead of bottom dollars, as well as focusing on the macro level of patient care and looking at some of the larger level factors. So it should be some great points of conversation. And with that much as a short introduction, welcome on the podcast, Jacob.
Yeah, thanks, Devin. Looking forward to a good conversation.
Absolutely, looking forward to it as well. So now I just gave kind of a quick overview of kind of the topics at hand that we'll be talking through a bit. Now, before we dive into that, as a quick reminder to the audience, so Jake was on our sister podcast, the Inventive Journey podcast. So if you want to go and hear a little bit more about his journey there, definitely encourage you to do so. But for those that haven't had a chance to go catch that episode yet, maybe just take just a minute or two and just to introduce yourself to the audience.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think you said something that made it clear that I consider myself broadly interdisciplinary, or I come from academia. It's an academic term. Multidimensional. I have various interests, and one of my favorite things to do is connect the dots between them. So on the professional side, what informs me is training in public health, social work, gerontology, dabbling in some sciences and theology. On the professional side, I have, other than being a business owner as well, I've had two open heart surgeries. I have complex medical needs, and I've also been a caregiver. And so I also see how our healthcare system here in the U.S. works from a personal standpoint, and all that put together. Like I'm just trying to make some changes because changes are needed.
Awesome. Sounds or was a great introduction, a great background, and I'm sure it'll make for a great conversation. So now diving into the topic, or we have a number of topics we could hit on, but maybe in no particular order. One of the first ones, we talked about a little bit before the podcast about, there's a number of different people that are within the healthcare industry. You have everything from doctors, you have hospitals, you have more of the bureaucracy side. You have patients, you have caregivers, you have insurance providers, a number of different players. And sometimes it can a bit be lost within the all of those players as to who should be the focus and what that focus should entail. So maybe give us a little bit of an idea, kind of who do you see as the central players, and how do you make sure to get those or to have the proper focus on them?
Yeah, no, you summarized that well. It's on the one hand, it is much more it is pretty complicated with all these different players in our healthcare system. But on the other hand, it's often treated way too simply, where, hey, this is what your doctor says. The patient is the passive recipient of that, and go do those things. It is becoming better. We are moving away from the patient merely being, like I said, a passive recipient, or like on a manufacturing line. We'll just shuttle them through um, to now where more and more people and some physicians are getting involved in this, advocating for patient rights, and the greater centrality of the patient, which is how I think that it should be. It shouldn't be this hierarchical system. It should be the patient and their caregivers if needed are at the center, and everything else kind of comes out from that. And not only that, but the different systems such as different specialists, pharmacists, um, rehab facilities, caregivers and families, all these different systems have better connections between them. And we have local examples here and there where we can see that it's possible, but it's still not happening on a large scale. And that's what we get. That's when we have a healthcare system that insists on running more like a business than it does a necessary set of services.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Now, so what do so one thing is to realize, hey, there's a lot of different players in there, competing interests, and focusing on, trying to align what that focus should be. Kind of a different or aspect is what you actually do in order to put them at the center.
Mm.
So you started to touch on that, but kind of how do you go about kind of giving both the patients and the caregivers kind of that central role, or making sure that that's where the focus is and where it should be? Kind of any thoughts on maybe some of the ways that you go about tackling that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a common question I get as I sit here and I talk about these issues, and we're like, how are you going to solve these higher order issues? And listen, if I sat here and told you that I was going to try to change the entire system, I would just be full of shit. So that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm not going to convince insurance company or the people at the very top to stop loving money. That's not going to happen. But there are things that we can do. So I typically come in and work more at the level of the patient or the caregiver. And I've learned things being a patient and a caregiver myself of little strategies along the way that other people didn't tell me. Like my physicians and nurses didn't tell me. It was just kind of stumbling through my own medical care. I'm like, hey, these are things that I can do to squeeze a little bit more juice to make things a little bit more helpful. And so I'll just share with a lot of patients and caregivers, like, listen, do these things. And it'll end up going a lot farther. And none of this is going to change the ultimate system, but there's more that we can do at the local level. I do like talking to physicians and nurses about things that they can do better. That's a little bit harder of a group to break into because I'm not a clinician myself, but I am working on it. And like I said, many of them are increasingly caring about these issues as well. I used to think that all the complaints that I have about health insurance companies, that physicians and their offices were in cahoots with them, but actually it turns out the physicians can't stand health insurance companies as just like we patients can't. So I think there's a lot of room there. And that to me it's me working more on the how do I educate individuals rather than going the policy route. Maybe I'll tackle that someday, but that's not what I'm doing right now. Does that answer your question?
Yes, answers my question. Didn't have any expectations as to what the answer was. Just it was, or definitely was insightful as to the thoughts that you provided. Now, shifting gears, but I think it goes along with a little bit of what you answered and some of your thoughts. One of the other things that we talked about, and I think it's an ongoing conversation, and I honestly get, also, or there are multiple sides of the issue, which is, there is on the one side you have, hey, this should be a focus on outcomes instead of the bottom dollar. Well, that's easy to say if you're the patient. You just want, hey, it's kind of like, across everything, I want as much as I can get for as little amount of money as I can pay for. Same thing on the legal, right? Or if you go buy a
Yeah.
house, or if you buy a car, I want as much house as I can get, and I want to pay as little. I always want to find that deal where I get an amazing mansion and I pay $1 for it. And yet it's hard to do that because on the flip side, just as when you're buying or you're selling the home, you just want the opposite. You want to get as much money as possible for the investment. And you have that same kind
Yeah.
of tug and pull within the healthcare industry, which is if I'm on the insurer side, I've got a lot of people, I've got a lot of expenses, I've got a lot of demands, and I've also got investors and shareholders, and they are looking for an outcome that is going to be profitable from them and justifies the outlay of cash and the expense. And on the other side, the patient, when you're looking at it from the healthcare provider, from the patients, as they're wanting the best possible outcome without having to go broke in order to get it. And so I think there's a natural tension between those two. And so how do you go and balance it rather than just say, hey, we should do all outcomes as best as possible, no matter the expense. And we're not going to even or consider that it might, be a cost, which I think is probably too unrealistic. So how do you balance that of, getting or focusing on the outcomes without just simply putting aside and saying we're not even going to consider how it's going to be funded. Kind of any thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. First of all, from my perspective, it depends who I'm having the conversation with. When I'm talking to a patient or someone who's in the midst of a health crisis, they don't give a damn about what at that in that current moment what the policies are or what the big picture efforts are going on. So I got to focus on that particular thing. From another perspective, I have tons of um, nurses and doctors and mental health providers and social workers in my network, most of which is on LinkedIn. And there are a lot of, I participate in these conversations, and there are a lot of people who are working on these higher level issues. One of the common things that I see, because I have a ton of mental health care providers in my network, that comes with me being a social worker, um, is complaining about how the reimbursement rates that mental health therapists get from insurance companies for the sessions that they do, mental health care sessions, that they're insubstantial, they're not enough, insufficient. And so there's a conversation about, well, should I just do private pay and whatnot? And so there are these people who are working on these higher order issues. And even though I'm not doing it myself directly right now, I still network with them. We still exchange ideas. There's still valuable value in us being in one another's network. Um, and then, like I said, when it comes to providers, there are those providers who are very, very straightforward. Like, hey, listen, I'm just going to make this as simple as possible. This is the order of events that an insurance company dictates, and I'm just going to tell you the least amount possible for me to get my paycheck. But you have these other examples of physicians who go a little bit extra, spend a little bit more time in the meeting with you, tell you some things that aren't covered by insurance, like, hey, go see PT, or hey, do this, or hey, join this Facebook group or whatever. So the fact that we have examples of things of people doing well, that's good enough for us to see that, hey, it's possible. And so one thing I'll tell my patients is, like me, if they have multiple specialists that they see, I have like 10 different kinds of doctors that I see. And I mainly focus on older adults. Most of them have comorbidity, so they have multiple providers, and I say, listen, you're not gonna win with every single one of them, but if you have one or two or three providers who are in your corner, then that can go a long way toward things. And so basically what I'm saying is I think that there is enough out there that's going on at these different levels. And there are enough examples of healthcare providers that are good and they are concerned about outcomes, not just cost, that I think that it's encouraging for us to kind of continue moving forward and seeing these examples as being successful. So to summarize what I just said, it depends on who my audience is, it depends on who I'm talking about, but there's enough out there to suggest that this can be done more than it's currently being done. Again, I'm not going to convince billionaires at the top to stop loving money, but there is more that we can do. There's enough example of it going on. So I'll pause there because I could just go on a soapbox about it all day long.
And maybe, you say there's some examples going on. So maybe walk us through kind of what are, a little bit more in depth. What are some of those examples or how have people successfully navigated that?
Well, like I said, you know, I have one or two providers myself who are willing to go the extra mile, and sometimes they're willing to call one of my other providers because there's no condition, there's no medication, there's no procedure, there's no aspect of anyone's care that exists in a vacuum. So the things that I see my cardiologist for, the things that I see my neurologist for, a lot of times they interact with one another. One may not be as transparent as the other, but if one of those is, they'll reach out to that other provider. Offices have, I have some that have really excellent patient portals where I can go online and message someone and they'll respond. Or I have the cell phone number that I can text with some of my nurses. And so again, I help my patients find, well, what are all the ways that you have to access your medical care. Make sure you use all of those. And again, it's not going to be perfect, but there are enough of those. And then on the macro side, like I said, I am involved in so many different conversations with people who are trying to form unions, trying to change policy, trying to do some of these bigger picture things. And none of that could happen if all of us were not in the network together exchanging ideas. So I just try to stay present in these groups and try to continue sharing my ideas, and they do the same. I think I may be getting at your question, but let me know if not.
No, I think that definitely is a good provides some great insight and kind of now maybe to dovetail onto that because one of the other areas that we'd talked a little bit about before is I think that sometimes what's helpful is taking a step back and looking at sometimes the macro level of patient care and some of those larger level factors. In other words, sometimes it's the forest or the trees, and oftentimes the reason that you look at the trees is because they're directly in front of you. And if you're walking through the forest, the trees are the things that you tend to pay attention to. And so because of that, you miss kind of the larger picture. So what are some of those kind of larger level factors? I know you touched on a few, but what are any other thoughts on kind of the larger level factors and that macro level that people should be looking at or considering?
Yeah, for sure. And I'm sitting here talking, I've probably spent more time talking about what I'm doing more on the individual level than I have the macro level. I actually am a public health professional. I care much more about that intellectually. It's just I often come in through the other door because of my own personal experiences. But one of my favorite examples to give is something that I'm actually that's relevant for me. This is me that I'm about to tell you about is I moved to this area and I live in one of the fastest growing counties in the country. And when I first moved here, was it 4 years ago? Almost 4 years ago, I immediately have to start establishing myself with my providers, especially a GP and a cardiologist like that. My life is dependent on that. And so within a few months, it's pretty clear that the waiting rooms are filled up. I had to schedule my appointments 8 months in advance. And the doctor's rushed when he comes in and doesn't have much time. And it's really frustrating for me to be uh, it was easy for me, I'm sorry, it was easy for me to be frustrated with those providers and offices for accepting too many patients or whatever. But if I stopped there, that's the conclusion I would have. Then I started to realize, you know what? We're having a lot of population growth in this area. You can't drive 5 minutes in any direction and not see evidence of that. There's always a neighborhood or apartment complex going up. And so I started doing the math and realizing, whoa, the population growth here is probably contributing to why doctors are stopping to accepting patients, why I have to schedule so many things in advance, appointments in advance, so long in advance and whatnot. And so I started asking my providers, like, hey, are you also concerned like I am about the population growth, right? And they said, yeah, it's going to be a huge problem. So I'm genuinely concerned about healthcare access here in the future because, for example, I'm at higher risk of stroke because I'm on blood thinners, and if that happens, I got to see medical attention within half an hour. Or things are going to get pretty dire after that. So I can't afford for things to be too crowded. I can't afford to not get that attention. So my wife and I have had conversations like, hey, should we move to a bigger city? Should we move to another place where these issues don't exist? I could not possibly understand what's going on with this unless I zoom out to a more macro level and realize that these demographic patterns are affecting what's going on for me at the local level. And then it gets even more so when we're talking about moving to other cities. And it's not easy to find an American city that has stroke certified hospitals, but it's not too crowded, or it's good to raise a family, has good education, has its access to a near airport that isn't also growing really rapidly. But again, we have to count for those things if we're trying to make these decisions. So I know I only zoomed out a little bit, but I'm just showing you how to understand these things, we have to zoom out beyond the level of the individual at these demographic patterns going on. And of course, if I'm talking about working as a public health professional, we can zoom way out and just really quick another example, and this is something that I might talk about with other public health professionals or policymakers or whatnot, but I'm a gerontologist, right? So I'm very interested in what's going on with population aging, and it is a fact that population aging has a strong intimate relationship with immigration in that older adults we prefer to die in our own homes, and so those who can afford to do so, instead of going to a nursing home, they die in their own homes. But they're going to get sicker, right? They're going to need informal caregivers. And which type of person is most likely, increasingly, to fill that role? It is immigrants. So when people talk to me about, hey, I had this particular view on immigration, it rarely ever is one of their factors like, okay, who's going to support the aging population? We have to be asking that question, right? So all I'm saying is all of these different things are connected, and we cannot possibly understand it fully unless we're willing and able to zoom out at these different levels and analyze things from these various perspectives. Okay, I'll stop there.
No, that was definitely a great overview. A lot of good insight and lots of things, items to consider. And so now with that, we're already reaching towards the end of the of this episode. Always try and keep it in bite-sized and reasonable
Yeah, my
chunks.
bad.
And it feels like no, you're great. It was a lot of great items to hit on. So no apologies at all. And I love to. We'll have to have the yeah on to one of our sister podcasts and can maybe pick up the conversation there and continue forward. So definitely is a lot of good areas to explore. But now, as we do wrap towards the end of this episode, I'd always like to wrap up with the same or same question. So we'll hit on that now, which is within your industry, what is the greatest myth? Why is it wrong?
I more recently got into AI. There's some really interesting stuff with AI, tech, and healthcare. I won't go into detail with those, but I what I will say, because I can see the conversations that are going on, like will AI ever replace human therapists? And people get very passionate about their answer to that. I personally think their answer is yes. My point for using that as an example is um, we need to constantly be innovating and adapting to the game. Stands itself up as something that's being old and traditional. It would never change. This is our strength. I think we're moving to a time where that the exact opposite needs to be the case. And we need to be okay with that, where the science is not always going to be exact, but we have to adapt. And AI is just one of many ways we can say that that's true. So the myth is the status quo is not always the best, and we're going to need to get to challenge it.
No, I think that's absolutely true. And I think that, the broader stroke is across the board, right? And we face
Yeah,
that same thing within the legal industry. And, there
yeah,
are proponents that say, no, we need to, attorneys and, individuals that or touch on and do every aspect of the legal because otherwise AI will mess it up and it will have severe
yeah,
consequences. And yet on the other side, you're looking saying, okay, but a lot of times what attorneys will do is they will take forms and templates that they've used for a lot of previous cases. They'll make minor tweaks and updates. I'm not saying that's all, that's very simplistic, but
yeah,
they'll do
yeah.
that, make minor updates, and then charge, people an exorbitant amount. And while that may have worked for historically, there's going to be people that are going to leverage AI and attorneys and firms and that they're going to say we can do a better offer, cheaper, better outcomes, and it's an area to integrate in. So I think that's definitely a great one that you touched on and makes perfect sense on a myth to dispel. Well, now as we do wrap towards the end of the episode, if people want to reach out to you, they want to be a customer, they want to be a client, they want to be an employee, they want to be an investor, they want to be your next best friend, any or all of the above, what's the best way to reach out to you, contact you, find out more?
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for asking. So I do speaking and consulting on these very issues, and it's thesmartpatient.com. Thesmartpatient.com is my website. I also do a lot of things on LinkedIn. Jacob Evans Kendall is my handle on there. So either one of those would be great.
Awesome. Well, I definitely encourage people to reach out, support a great business, make a new connection, expand their network, and nothing else, make a new best friend. So, with
Yeah.
that, thank you. Thank you again for coming on the podcast. It's been a fun, it's been a pleasure. Now, for all of you that are listeners are out there, if you have your own journey to share and you'd like to be a guest on the podcast, we'd love to have you. So go to inventiveunicorn.com, apply to be on the show. A couple more things as listeners, make sure to click share, subscribe, leave us a review, helps us to reach even more startups and small businesses to help them along their journey to success. And along that note, if you ever need help along your journey with patents or trademarks or anything else with your startup or your small business, just go to strategymeeting.com, grab some time with us to chat, and we are always here to help. Well, thank you again for coming on the podcast and wish the next leg of your journey even better than the last.